There was once a queen who dreamed of happiness, but awoke in a world that did not forgive her dreams. Beneath the golden ceilings of Versailles, laughter echoed through endless mirrors, while outside, the hunger of a nation whispered her name. Marie Antoinette, the girl who was born to be adored, yet remembered as the symbol of excess. Tonight, as the moon drifts softly over history's quiet corridors, we return to her, not as a queen, not as a sinner, but as a woman who lived inside a dream that slowly became her undoing. If these words carry you closer to sleep, let this channel stay by your side too, a soft voice in the dark, whispering stories the world has almost forgotten. The world that welcomed Maria Antonia of Austria in 1755 was one wrapped in ceremony and snow. Vienna, the city of music and power, hummed with the quiet order of empire. She was the 15th child of Empress Maria Theresa, a woman both adored and feared, whose will could bend a continent. And yet, in the soft light of the Schönbrunn Palace, Maria Antonia was not an empress or a symbol. She was simply a girl who loved laughter and song. Her tutors often found her staring out the window, watching the carriages pass, her thoughts already drifting beyond the marble gardens. From her earliest days, her life was written in ink, not her own. Every lesson, every smile, every word spoken at court was part of a script written for her long before she could read. To be born into royalty was to be born into purpose, not of the heart, but of the crown. Her education was light, her penmanship clumsy, but her charm was disarming. She would curtsy and laugh and make even her strict mother pause before scolding her. Maria Theresa loved her children fiercely, but she loved the empire more. And so, when diplomacy called, even love had to bow. The winds of alliance had turned cold between Austria and France. Once bitter enemies, now they sought peace, not through treaties or trust, but through marriage. The young Louis Auguste, Dauphin of France, needed a bride. And Maria Antonia, with her fair curls and unguarded smile, seemed the perfect offering. In Vienna, whispers filled the palace halls. She will be Queen of France, they said. The words thrilled her, frightened her, reshaped her. For a girl of 14, the world had already begun to close around her like a silken cage. Her wedding was arranged before she had time to dream of love. Painters came to capture her likeness for the court of Versailles, smoothing away the traces of childhood from her face. Tailors fitted her in gowns she could hardly move in, while courtiers rehearsed the rituals she would soon perform before 1,000 eyes. On the morning of her departure, her mother kissed her hand, not gently, but with the firm tenderness of farewell. "Remember who you are," the empress said. But perhaps even then, Maria Antonia sensed that she was about to become someone else entirely. When her carriage rolled away from Vienna, the air felt thin. The roads stretched endlessly through forests and fields, each mile carrying her further from home. At the border between Austria and France, a strange ritual awaited her, the handover. In a gilded pavilion, she was to strip away everything Austrian, her clothes, her jewelry, even her name. The attendant spoke softly but firmly. She was no longer Maria Antonia. She was now Marie Antoinette, Dauphine of France. The girl vanished, replaced by a promise. As the doors of the French court opened before her, the scent of perfume and power filled the air. Versailles was unlike anything she had ever imagined, a world of gold, mirrors, and whispers. Every movement had meaning, every glance a hidden message. The courtiers studied her with the polite cruelty of those who had already decided what she should be. She smiled too much, they said. She spoke French with an accent. She was Austrian, and in the eyes of many, that alone was enough to mistrust her. Still, she tried. Her laughter rippled through the endless corridors, light and musical, like a song trying to survive in the echoing stillness of marble halls. The young Dauphin, shy and uncertain, hardly spoke to her. He preferred solitude, locks, and keys, a boy still lost inside his own silence. They were two strangers married by history, both too young to understand the cost. Yet in her letters home, she spoke kindly of him, calling him gentle, even sweet. Perhaps, she hoped, love might bloom in the quiet spaces between duty and expectation. At night, she would stand at the window of her chamber, watching the lanterns flicker in the gardens below. The fountains murmured like distant lullabies, but her heart felt restless. She missed Vienna's laughter, the sound of her sister's footsteps, the warmth of her mother's voice. Here, every gesture was judged, every smile dissected. Versailles was not a home, it was a theater, and she, the star of a play she did not write. And yet, in the soft hours before dawn, when the court finally slept, Marie would sometimes hum the Austrian folk songs of her childhood, a quiet rebellion, a whisper to the girl she once was. Outside, the wind moved through the gardens of Versailles, stirring the roses planted for her arrival. They called her the Dauphine of Grace. But grace, she would soon learn, was a fragile thing, beautiful to watch, impossible to hold. And so, as the moon faded over the palace roofs, the young queen-to-be lay awake in her golden bed, caught between two worlds, one of memory, one of expectation. The story of her life had only just begun, and already it felt like something slipping away. Morning at Versailles was not the gentle kind she had known in Vienna. Here the sun did not wake the palace. Ceremony did. The sound of footsteps, of doors opening, of murmured titles and greetings filled her chamber before she could even lift her head from the pillow. Servants stood in precise lines, waiting for the ritual to begin. Her body was no longer her own. It belonged to the eyes of the court, to custom, to France. They dressed her layer by layer, linen, lace, corset, silk, powder, until the girl beneath disappeared entirely. The air smelled of rosewater and starch. Even her smile had to be rehearsed, delicate but never too bold, gracious but never too warm. She would sit before the mirror while attendants adjusted her jewels, and sometimes she would stare into her own reflection, almost as if waiting for Marie Antoinette to appear again, the child who laughed in Vienna's gardens. But that girl was gone, buried under the powdered face of a queen-to-be. Versailles was a world that glittered but did not glow. The palace stretched like a dream made of glass, too perfect to feel alive. Every gesture was choreographed. Every conversation weighed for its consequence. Even laughter had to be performed correctly. And so, Marie learned the art of survival, to speak softly, to smile just enough, to float through the air like perfume, present but untouchable. It was a performance she would play for the rest of her life. Louis Auguste, her husband, was gentle in manner but distant in spirit. He loved his clocks and keys more than conversation. They dined together, they walked the gardens, but there was a silence between them, a silence filled with all the things neither knew how to say. He was shy, unsure, burdened by the shadow of kings before him. She was lonely, a child surrounded by strangers. In the flickering candlelight, their marriage looked like peace, but in truth, it was emptiness dressed in ceremony. The court began to whisper. They whispered about her accent, about her laughter, about the way she looked at people, too kind, too careless, too foreign. They called her l'Autrichienne, the Austrian woman, but the word twisted into something cruel, a slur that dripped with suspicion. She did not yet understand it, but her every gesture was already being rewritten into myth. A smile became vanity, a gift became arrogance, a misstep became treason. Versailles, with all its light, was already casting her shadow. And still she tried to please them. She attended endless receptions, smiled until her cheeks ached, and danced beneath the chandeliers until her feet throbbed. She thought kindness could soften their judgment. But kindness, at Versailles, was not a virtue, it was a weakness. The courtiers wanted spectacle, not sincerity. They wanted to be entertained, not understood. At night, when the corridors grew still, Marie would remove her jewels one by one, laying them on the table like pieces of armor. She would walk barefoot across the cold marble floor and press her hand against the glass of the window. Outside, the moon lit the gardens, the same gardens where, years later, she would seek refuge in laughter and play. But now, in this quiet, she felt something she could not name. A heaviness, a kind of distance between herself and the world she was meant to rule. In her letters home, she wrote of her new life with the politeness of duty. She told her mother that her husband was kind, that the court was magnificent, that she was learning to fit in. But between the lines, the sadness bled through, a soft ache for something simpler, for a place where her name did not echo down endless halls. Maria Theresa's replies were filled with advice and correction. Be more cautious, she would write. Win their hearts. But one cannot win hearts that never wanted to be won. The seasons changed, and Versailles bloomed in summer's brilliance. Festivals, hunts, concerts, each one a performance meant to show the glory of France. Marie smiled through it all, the young foreign queen adored by painters and musicians. But admiration is not affection. The courtiers watched her not with love, but curiosity, like one might watch a candle to see how long it burns before it fades. One evening, as she stood at the balcony overlooking the Grand Canal, the sunset brushed the sky with gold and rose. The wind carried the scent of orange blossoms. For a moment, she closed her eyes and imagined Vienna, the laughter of her sisters, the sound of horses in the courtyard, the voice of her mother calling her name. A tear gathered small and bright, then vanished into her silk sleeve. She was 15, married, and already lonely. The world saw her as a queen in waiting, a figure of elegance. But in truth, she was still a child, searching for her place in a story she did not understand. The weight of France rested quietly upon her shoulders, though she did not yet feel its full gravity. That would come later, with crowns, with rumors, with revolutions. For now, the palace lights flickered against the night, and the girl from Vienna whispered to the stars in a language no one at Versailles would ever care to learn. And so, as the night deepened over the mirrors of the palace, Marie Antoinette began to dream, not of power, but of belonging. A dream so fragile, so human, that it would one day cost her everything. When Louis XVI ascended the throne, he was only 20, and Marie Antoinette, barely 19, became queen. Outside the palace gates, bells rang across France, echoing through fields and villages as people cheered for their young monarchs. But inside Versailles, the sound was softer, almost uncertain. To many, it did not feel like the dawn of a new era. It felt like a continuation of the old, wrapped in ribbons and ceremony. The coronation was grand, luminous, but beneath the gold and incense lingered an emptiness neither of them could name. Louis was kind, dutiful, even gentle, but he was a man who mistook silence for strength. He ruled by caution, by hesitation, and in his uncertainty, others began to rule through him. Marie, still bright with the hunger for life, tried to fill that silence with laughter, with color, with youth. But every joy she reached for seemed to harden the world against her. The palace, for all its mirrors, reflected nothing true. Courtiers flattered her when she entered a room and mocked her when she left it. Ministers weighed every word she spoke as if it were a threat. In public, she was expected to shine, to be a living symbol of beauty, grace, and obedience. But in private, she began to feel like a ghost, drifting through her own life. To survive, she sought small freedoms, fragile spaces where she could breathe. The Petit Trianon became her refuge, a small estate nestled within the gardens of Versailles, hidden behind walls of roses and fountains. There she could escape the endless theater of the court. She built a world that looked nothing like a palace, a world of meadows and cottages, of laughter and song. She walked barefoot on the grass, played shepherdess among friends, and watched her children run through the fields without bowing to anyone. To the courtiers, it was scandal. To the people of France, it was proof of arrogance. They said she mocked their hunger with her games of simplicity. That while mothers starved in the streets, the queen played at poverty in silk ribbons and straw hats. Rumors spread like wildfire that she threw away fortunes on jewels, that she danced while France decayed. Few cared to know the truth. The image of Madame Deficit had already begun to take shape, and once history paints you in cruelty, it rarely repaints you in kindness. And yet, inside her private world, Marie was not the heartless creature they imagined. She was restless, yes, but not unfeeling. She loved her children fiercely, wrote tender letters to friends, and filled her rooms with music and laughter. The Petit Trianon was her rebellion against a life that demanded perfection. There she could be imperfect, human, spontaneous, alive. For a few fleeting years, it worked. The air felt lighter, her heart less heavy. But peace in her world was always borrowed time. The state's debts grew heavy, and the people's patience grew thin. Bread prices rose, crops failed. The laughter from her gardens began to sound, in the ears of the hungry, like mockery. Pamphlets accused her of infidelity, of greed, of treason. Men who had never seen her face drew her in crude caricatures, turning her body into the symbol of France's corruption. Inside the palace, the whispers became daggers. Ministers blamed her influence for failed reforms. Courtiers blamed her for their own misfortunes. She was no longer just the foreign queen. She was becoming the face of everything that was wrong with the kingdom. And yet, in the stillness of night, when the candles burned low and the corridors fell quiet, she would sometimes walk through her private gardens alone. The scent of lilac followed her. The moonlight softened the sharpness of her reality. She would stop beside the small lake, watching the water reflect her face, pale, tired, but strangely calm. "They don't know me," she might whisper, her voice trembling like a prayer. They never did. It is easy, from a distance, to see her as vain, as foolish, as blind. But imagine a girl raised to be loved, finding herself in a world where every kindness is a weapon, every joy a scandal. Imagine waking each morning knowing that your smile will be dissected in pamphlets, your laughter turned into evidence. She lived surrounded by gold and mirrors, but what she wanted most was something ordinary, a moment that belonged only to her. Sometimes she would sit by the window with her children sleeping nearby, the air thick with the scent of lavender. She would watch the stars fade slowly into dawn, her thoughts drifting between hope and fear. Somewhere beyond those palace walls, a different France was waking, hungry, restless, waiting. And so, as the first light touched the horizon, the queen closed her eyes and breathed deeply, unaware that her longing for life, for something real, something free, would soon collide with the fury of a nation. Even in the midst of her hidden world, reality always had a way of seeping through. Letters from Paris arrived with news both mundane and urgent, reminders that the kingdom outside her gardens was restless. Merchants complained of rising prices, and the common people murmured against taxes, against the nobles, against everything the crown represented. For the queen, the news was both distant and intimate, a reminder that privilege could never fully shield her from consequence. At Petit Trianon, she sought comfort in ritual. She tended the gardens herself, planting flowers with her gloved hands, watering the fountains, and sometimes speaking softly to the birds that flitted about the terraces. These moments were her small rebellions, proof that life, in its simplest form, could still belong to her. Here, she could play, she could laugh, she could breathe. And yet, even in her sanctuary, the court found ways to intrude. Courtiers arrived unannounced, eager to be entertained, eager to witness the queen in her most private moments, as if her desire for peace were an invitation to judgment. Marie's days became a delicate dance between freedom and performance. She rode horseback through the gardens, skirts brushing the dew, hair loose against the wind, pretending the world beyond the walls did not exist. Children played at her feet, laughing without restraint. Music floated from hidden pavilions, a soft soundtrack to her fleeting happiness. And at night, she would sit beside the lake, watching her own reflection ripple across the water, as if seeking the girl she had once been. That girl from Vienna, who had laughed easily, who had loved simply, who had never yet learned the weight of expectation. But whispers were never far away. Newspapers printed scandalous poems, satirical drawings, and pamphlets accusing her of every imaginable crime. Madame Deficit, they called her, blaming her for debts she did not personally create, for extravagances she did not fully orchestrate. In the streets, the people's anger grew, a low hum that even the palace walls could not silence. Every smile she offered in public, every ornament she wore, was twisted into proof of indifference. It was in these moments, when the weight of perception pressed hardest, that Marie began to understand the cruel truth of her existence. She was adored and despised in equal measure, admired for beauty, yet blamed for circumstance. The woman in the mirror, the young queen with laughter in her eyes and tenderness in her heart, had to navigate a world that valued spectacle over sincerity, that punished emotion with rumors, that demanded perfection while ignoring humanity. And still, she persisted. She hosted musical evenings where friends whispered secrets in hushed tones. She staged small plays with her children, their voices mingling with hers in laughter. She ordered the construction of little cottages in her gardens, places where she could retreat and pretend for hours that she was not a queen at all, but a child again. These illusions, fragile as they were, kept her soul tethered to hope. At times, she would catch a glimpse of the outside world beyond her gates, a baker hurrying to deliver bread, a woman carrying her child through mud-slicked streets, and her heart would ache. The pleasures she allowed herself in the gardens of Versailles felt almost wrong, guilty even, against the backdrop of suffering beyond her walls. Yet she could not stop herself from seeking moments of life, moments of joy, no matter how fleeting. And so, the queen continued to exist between two realities, one of gold and mirrors, of music and silk. where she could almost feel free, and one of streets and whispers, of hunger and anger, where her every gesture was scrutinized and condemned. It was a precarious balance, a silent tension that she carried like a second crown, heavier than any jeweled circlet could ever be. As the sun set over the palace grounds, painting the gardens in shades of rose and amber, Marie Antoinette would sit by the Petit Trianon's fountains, listening to the water trickle like a soft lullaby. She would close her eyes and imagine that the whispers and judgments belonged to someone else, that she could exist simply as herself, if only for a moment. And in those moments, she tasted the sweetness of life she had been searching for since the day she arrived in France. As the night stretched over the palace, the queen's heart remained both restless and hopeful, suspended between the world she longed to inhabit and the world that demanded her perfection. A fragile joy lingered, like the last note of a lullaby, waiting for dawn, waiting for history, waiting for the storms to come. The palace that had once seemed eternal began to feel smaller, as if the weight of history itself pressed down on the gilded walls. Outside, France was changing in ways that no queen, no court, no ceremony could contain. Bread prices rose higher than any crown could measure, and the streets of Paris murmured with impatience, then shouted with anger. In the grand halls of Versailles, the courtiers still moved as if nothing had shifted, unaware that the world beyond their mirrors had begun to crumble. Marie Antoinette felt it in every whisper, in every cautious glance cast in her direction. The laughter she had once relied on to soothe her own loneliness now seemed hollow, even dangerous. Courtiers told stories of riots, of mobs, of revolutionary fervor in the city streets. Yet in their eyes, she remained a creature apart, beautiful, untouchable, almost unreal. She walked the corridors of her palace, feeling the gold beneath her fingertips, the cold marble under her feet, and wondered how such luxury could exist when the world outside was suffering. The Dauphin, Louis, remained hesitant even in the face of rising unrest. He clung to tradition, to ritual, as though the monarchy could withstand a storm simply by continuing the same motions as before. But history was no longer gentle. It moved fast and without mercy, like water breaking through a dam. And the queen, once admired for her grace and beauty, began to see the truth in whispers and pamphlets, the truth that every gesture could be twisted into a crime, every smile into mockery. The royal family retreated into the Tuileries, away from the formalities of Versailles, yet even these walls could not shield them. Soldiers guarded the gates, but the air outside was electric, charged with the impatience of those who had been denied bread, justice, and dignity. Every day brought a new rumor, a new accusation. Marie Antoinette, once the embodiment of elegance and youth, had become the face of everything the revolutionaries despised. She was no longer merely a queen. She was a symbol, a lightning rod for the fury of a nation. Inside her chambers, she tried to maintain composure. She wrote letters to her children, whispering reassurances she did not always feel, reminding them to be brave, to endure, to survive. Her own bravery wavered beneath the weight of rumor and fear. Nights were the hardest, when the corridors fell silent, when shadows crept through the windows, when she could no longer pretend that all was well. The mirrors reflected not her face, but the image she had been forced to become, a queen without friends, a figure of blame, a human caught in the machinery of history. And yet, she would rise each morning, as she always had, with a careful smile, walking through halls that seemed to shrink with every passing day. She spoke to her attendants gently, moved among her children with tenderness, and tried to find some thread of normalcy in the chaos. But the world outside would not be placated. Farmers and bakers, merchants and mothers, all felt the pinch of hunger and the sting of inequality. They wanted change, and soon. And the queen, so young, so human, was caught in the cross-current of history's relentless tide. As summer deepened, the gardens of Versailles, once filled with music and joy, became eerily quiet. Fountains dripped in solitude, flowers bent beneath the heat, and even the birds seemed cautious, as if the air itself carried the tension of unrest. The Petit Trianon, her refuge, offered only temporary solace. She could walk barefoot among the flowers, but beyond the hedges, whispers of revolution grew louder. Every letter, every report, every shadow hinted at the inevitability of change. Marie Antoinette felt it in her bones. The world she had known, The world she had tried to shape with laughter and small acts of freedom was slipping away. The corridors of Versailles, once endless and inviting, now felt like a cage. And in the quiet hours before dawn, she would sometimes press her hand to the cool glass of a window, staring into the misty gardens, whispering to herself how it had come to this. The night fell over the palace, soft and deceptive. In that darkness, the queen's heart trembled, suspended between memory and fear, between innocence and history. Outside, the streets were alive with murmurs that would soon become roars. And so, as the candlelight flickered across her chambers, Marie Antoinette felt the first true touch of a storm that would carry her and the monarchy toward a fate none could escape. The days that followed were a delicate tension stretched thin across every corridor, every gilded hall, every marble staircase of Versailles. The people of Paris no longer whispered, they shouted. Their anger was no longer contained to the city streets. It seeped into every message, every report, and eventually every moment of Marie Antoinette's life. Soldiers patrolled the palace grounds, yet no army could shield her from the weight of a nation turning against her. The walls of Versailles seemed suddenly hollow, echoing not the pomp of royalty, but the tremors of history pressing close. Marie walked softly through her chambers, avoiding the eyes of courtiers whose polite expressions barely hid their own fear. She moved as though on a stage, every gesture scrutinized, every step recorded by invisible witnesses. She began to feel the palace shrinking around her, the ceilings pressing closer, the mirrors reflecting not beauty, but inevitability. She was no longer just a queen. She was the symbol of a monarchy everyone now wanted to see crumble. Louis XVI, often quiet and hesitant, tried to navigate the turbulence with law and reason, but reason was no match for fervor. Marie watched him in those moments, his hands trembling slightly over documents, his voice soft but firm, and she realized they were both trapped, caught in a storm they did not summon but could not escape. She longed to speak, to calm, to soothe. But words felt fragile against the weight of history's growing momentum. The Petit Trianon offered small comfort, a fragile space where she could close the door and breathe. Here, she walked barefoot, letting the grass tickle her feet, listening to the fountains play their quiet music. In these rare moments of freedom, she imagined life could still be simple. Her children laughing in the sun, the wind brushing her hair, the world outside paused, just for a breath. Yet, even here, the shadows of the palace seemed to whisper, reminding her that the storm outside would not wait. One morning, a rider arrived from Paris with news that made her heart tighten like a frozen cord. The people had gathered, demanding bread, demanding justice, demanding her attention. They had stormed a baker's shop, and their cries had grown loud enough to pierce the quiet of the countryside. Marie read the letter, her hands trembling slightly, and looked across the gardens. The roses glimmered in the sunlight, and the fountains sparkled like diamonds. Yet the beauty could not disguise the truth. The world outside her walls had changed forever. She dressed slowly that day, choosing garments that were elegant but restrained, hoping to convey humility while maintaining dignity. Every ribbon, every fold of silk, every gesture of her hand was measured, as if the very threads of her gown could weave protection around her fragile heart. She met Louis in the library, their eyes sharing the silent understanding that the monarchy was no longer merely a privilege, but a responsibility that could not shield them from fear, anger, or history's judgment. The crowd in Paris grew bolder with every day. Women carrying empty baskets marched, their voices echoing with both desperation and resolve. Men followed, shouting slogans that twisted her image into a story of excess and cruelty. Marie Antoinette, the girl who had once dreamed of laughter and freedom, now found herself painted as the enemy of a people she had never wished to harm. It was no longer about silk gowns or whispered dances in gardens. It was about survival, both of body and of spirit. At night, she would sit by the Tuileries windows, looking across the moonlit grounds, imagining the city she could not see. She whispered to her children stories of the past, of Vienna, of the games they could play together when the world was kinder. Her voice trembled slightly, but she never allowed fear to settle fully in her words. The palace was quiet, but the silence carried its own weight, heavier than any cannon or sword. And so the queen learned to live between worlds, the gilded, fragile one of her palace and the turbulent, unforgiving one beyond the gates. Each day became a careful balance of ceremony, survival, and fleeting moments of quiet joy. She walked the corridors, smiled for the courtiers, soothed her children, all while the tremors of revolution edged ever closer. The walls that had once seemed eternal now felt like fragile glass, trembling with every rumor, every march, every cry from the streets. As the candles flickered in her chambers, Marie Antoinette pressed her hand to the cool marble window, staring into the darkness beyond. The shadows of Versailles stretched long and quiet across the gardens. Somewhere in that night, the people of France moved closer to a confrontation that no crown could withstand. And in the stillness, she felt the first true sense of fear. Not for herself, but for the children she loved, and for a world she had not yet been able to save. The grand halls of Paris were no longer gilded with laughter. The air was heavy with anticipation, and the shadows of history stretched long across cold stone walls. Marie Antoinette, once a queen surrounded by silk and mirrors, now walked slowly into a chamber where whispers had hardened into judgment. The crowd did not see a woman, but an idea, a symbol of excess, of decadence, of everything the revolution sought to eradicate. Every step she took echoed softly, carrying both grace and dread, as if the air itself held its breath. Her jewels were gone. Her gowns had been stripped of their silk and lace, leaving her in garments meant to humble, to signal submission. Titles had been erased, and the air smelled of ink, dust, and fear. She moved carefully, not because the floor was treacherous, but because the world she had known, the one built from childhood dreams, courtly dances, and secret gardens, no longer existed. The women who had once attended her whispered, the men who had once flattered her glared, and the judges, their faces carved with sternness, waited with the patience of inevitability. Accusations were read aloud: treason, extravagance, infidelity, betrayal. Every allegation was a thread, woven into a tapestry meant to define her as the villain of France. Yet Marie listened quietly, her voice held in a stillness that seemed impossible amid the sharp edges of accusation. She did not cry, did not plead excessively, and did not show the panic that might have been expected. Her eyes, calm and unwavering, reflected a deep understanding, not of innocence or guilt, but of the fragile, unyielding truth that history rarely spares kindness. She remembered her children as she sat there, their small faces lighting up her thoughts, their laughter still ringing in the gardens of Petit Trianon. She recalled the fleeting moments when she had allowed herself joy, a dance, a song, a walk in the moonlit garden, and she wondered if the world had ever truly seen her for who she was. Not the caricature printed in pamphlets, not the Madame Déficit, but the young girl who had left Vienna with dreams in her eyes, who had sought simply to be alive, to laugh, to love, to belong. The trial dragged on, hours folding into days, each one heavy with the weight of public expectation. Witnesses spoke against her, recounting rumors as if they were facts, gossip as if it were law. The courtroom, packed with citizens and officials alike, pulsed with the desire for spectacle and revenge. The queen, however, met each word with a quiet resilience. She answered only when necessary, her tone measured, almost hypnotic in its calmness. Those who expected rage, tears, or panic found only dignity, a strange, unsettling grace that seemed to mock the very idea of fear. Outside the hall, the city celebrated each accusation as a triumph. Revolutionaries carried banners, shouted slogans, and marked the streets with cries that echoed against stone and sky. Within, Marie's hands rested lightly on her lap, the tension of the trial pressing against her chest, yet never breaking her composure. The weight of the crown had shifted from her head to her heart. It was no longer about power or ceremony. It was about survival, about maintaining a fragile sense of self while the world demanded her destruction. Night fell over the city, cold and silent in comparison to the turmoil of the day. In her small chamber, she would sit by the window, the city lights distant and flickering, and think of the gardens she had once walked barefoot, the fountains that had sung her lullabies, the children who had run and laughed under the French sun. She whispered their names quietly, a soft prayer in the darkness. Even as the world outside condemned her, within her heart she nurtured a small flame of hope, fragile but enduring. Marie Antoinette moved through her trial like a ghost walking through a history she could not change. Each word spoken against her became another layer in the story that would survive long after her own life ended. A story written not by her hand, but by the eyes and voices of a nation. The queen, once adored, once feared, now existed in the quiet spaces between accusation and judgment, a figure of both inevitability and tragic grace. The days of the trial blurred together, each one carrying the weight of relentless scrutiny. Marie Antoinette moved through the courtroom with the poise of someone who had long since learned to live under observation, her every gesture measured, her every glance precise. She answered questions softly, deliberately, never rising to anger, never begging for mercy. Her calmness seemed almost unreal to those who expected hysteria. In a world that demanded spectacle, she offered only serenity, a quiet defiance that unsettled even the judges. The accusations piled higher, each one more fantastical than the last. She was accused of conspiring against the people, of plotting with foreign powers, of extravagance that had supposedly bankrupted the kingdom. Pamphlets and broadsheets printed her image with cruel exaggeration, her features distorted, her figure turned into a caricature of indulgence. Each rumor, each lie became a nail in the coffin of her reputation. Yet she bore it silently, as if aware that her dignity was the only thing left untouched. In the quiet moments between testimony, she would close her eyes and breathe deeply, remembering Petit Trianon, the gardens, the fountains, the music that had once filled her private world. She pictured her children's faces, innocent and trusting, and she whispered their names like a prayer to the darkness. Though her body was confined, her mind wandered freely, clinging to memories and imagined joys that the revolution could never steal. The city beyond the courtroom gates seethed with impatience. Crowds demanded her condemnation, their voices rising like tides against the walls of the palace. They did not know her as a woman, a mother, a girl who had been swept into history long before she was ready. They knew only the stories painted by fear, envy, and anger. Yet within her, a quiet flame endured, a stubborn insistence on humanity, on grace, on the last vestiges of the life she had once known. On some evenings, when the trial paused and the chambers grew still, she would write letters in trembling script, to her children, to her friends, to the past she could not reclaim. Her handwriting was small, careful, almost meditative, each word a tether to a world outside the courtroom's shadow. These letters were her secret rebellion, proof that even in the face of annihilation, she could preserve something of herself, something tender, something undeniably human. The final days of the trial were the hardest. Witnesses repeated themselves, accusations grew louder, and the whispers of the city carried the weight of judgment before the judges even spoke. The air was thick with anticipation, yet Marie moved through it with quiet fortitude. She did not tremble, she did not cry, she did not plead. She simply existed, in a calm that seemed almost unnatural, as if she were already beyond the reach of those who sought to define her. And then, at last, the sentence was read. Guilty. Death. The words fell softly, but their weight pressed heavily against her chest. In that moment, there was no grandeur, no ceremony, only the quiet inevitability of history closing its hand around her life. She folded her hands, straightened her posture, and let the words settle. She was no longer queen, no longer dauphine, no longer the young girl who had once dreamed of laughter and gardens. She was a woman standing at the edge of history, aware of the storm, yet unwavering in her quiet dignity. As the guards led her away, she glanced briefly at the city beyond the windows. Paris glimmered with a strange, unforgiving light, alive and unyielding. For a heartbeat, she imagined the Petit Trianon, the fountains, the laughter of her children. Then the world pulled her forward. She stepped into history, into legend, into the pages that would remember her not merely as a queen, but as a symbol of beauty, fragility, and the unyielding human spirit. Long after the candles of Versailles had burned down to stubs, long after the laughter and music had faded from the gilded halls, a quiet presence lingered among the marble floors and sunlit gardens. It was not a shadow cast by candlelight, nor a trick of the wind in the empty corridors. It was the echo of a life lived too brightly, too humanly, too fleetingly, the echo of Marie Antoinette herself. The palace, once vibrant with pomp and ceremony, now seemed to inhale softly, as if remembering her steps, her laughter, her whispered prayers in the quiet of night. Visitors who wandered the abandoned halls in later years would speak of a sense of being observed, a subtle weight in the air, a chill that carried not malice but sorrow. Sometimes a chair, once her own, seemed to tilt slightly, as though touched by an invisible hand. Sometimes the fountains in the gardens would spill water in gentle rhythm, though the pumps had long ceased. And in the mirrors that had reflected her powdered face, some claimed to see a flicker of her gaze, calm, almost tender, always wistful. Versailles, even in its silence, remembered. The walls retained the scent of roses from her gardens. The floors held the faint impressions of her dancing. The air seemed to hum softly with her songs. Courtiers and kings were gone. The revolution had swept away the lives, the titles, the ceremonies. But a presence remained, a memory stitched into the palace itself, haunting yet gentle, sorrowful yet serene. It was as if the building itself mourned the girl from Vienna, who had walked its halls barefoot, who had sought fleeting moments of joy amid the weight of expectation. Even the portraits of Marie, painted in her youth, carried the whisper of her humanity. In the brushstrokes of gold and silk, in the delicate curve of her smile, in the soft melancholy of her eyes, the viewer could sense the tension between innocence and history's cruelty. She was frozen in paint, yet somehow alive, a queen, a mother, a girl who had dreamed of laughter and freedom in a world that demanded perfection. Visitors sometimes paused by the Petit Trianon, where she had once wandered the gardens with bare feet, imagining a life away from the weight of crowns. The little cottages she had built to play at simplicity seemed to sigh beneath the wind. The flowers bent in the sun as if leaning toward a memory. The fountains murmured her name in quiet rhythm. She had sought life in small joys, and even after her passing, those joys seemed to linger like gentle whispers across the palace grounds. The city of Paris changed, centuries passing like pages turning in a book. Kings came and went. Revolutions erupted and subsided, yet the ghost of Versailles remained. Not as vengeance, not as fear, but as reflection. It reminded all who entered that human lives, delicate, flawed, and radiant, leave traces far beyond their moments. Marie Antoinette's laughter, her hope, her sorrow, her longing, all became a thread woven into the palace itself. She had lived, and through memory she continued to live, soft and haunting, like the last note of a lullaby echoing in the quiet of night. As the sun dipped low behind the hills, casting long shadows across the gardens, the palace seemed to breathe in rhythm with the memories it held. Every corridor, every archway, every gilded room seemed to hum softly with the presence of a queen who had walked those halls with both wonder and despair. Marie Antoinette's spirit lingered, not as a specter of fear, but as a quiet reminder of what it meant to live fully, to feel deeply, and to be both adored and misunderstood. Visitors wandering through the halls sometimes felt a tug at the edge of their consciousness, as if the palace itself were urging them to remember. They might catch a glimpse of a slipper by a fountain, worn not by time, but by memory. They might hear the faintest echo of music in a sunlit hall, or the soft laughter of a child among the flowers. It was not illusion. It was history's quiet insistence that life, even when ended, leaves traces that cannot be erased. The Petit Trianon, once her sanctuary, now stood as a living testament to her desire for freedom and joy. The small cottages she had built for play remained, touched by the wind and weather, but still echoing her spirit. It was here that she had walked barefoot, played among the roses, and whispered to her children stories of hope and laughter. Even centuries later, the air seemed to shimmer with that energy, a soft, enduring presence, as if she had never fully left. And so, Versailles became more than stone and gold. It became memory made tangible, a palace haunted not by fear or vengeance, but by the tenderness of a life both fragile and luminous. Marie Antoinette's story, cruelly cut short by revolution, found refuge here in the rhythm of fountains, the sway of trees, the lingering fragrance of roses. Every visitor, whether they knew her history or not, felt it, the weight of human longing, the beauty of joy amidst suffering, the quiet endurance of memory that refuses to fade. Even the nights seemed to remember her. Moonlight spilled across the marble floors, illuminating corridors where she had once walked. The gardens exhaled the fragrance of flowers she had loved, and the air carried the soft, almost imperceptible hum of her voice, like a lullaby passed down through centuries. It was a gentle haunting, one that invited reflection rather than fear, contemplation rather than sorrow. In this way, Marie Antoinette became more than history. She became a whisper, a presence, a reminder that human lives leave echoes far beyond their own time. The laughter she had sought, the small rebellions of joy, the love for her children, all lingered like soft music in the palace. Versailles had become a vessel for memory, and through it, she endured, serene, tender, haunting, eternally alive in the spaces she had once walked so fully. And as the moon rose high, casting silver light over the gardens, one could almost imagine her walking among the fountains once more, barefoot, laughing softly, a queen in spirit if not in crown, forever lingering in the heart of Versailles, where memory and history entwine like the delicate petals of a rose.